Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I go by Bones, and with us, as always, is RamX.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So in this episode, we're going to unpack a loosely structured but deeply interconnected network of charismatic dominionists, political operatives, intelligence outliers who leverage spiritual authority and conspiracy culture and a theology of control to infiltrate power structures. Their success isn't accidental. It is rooted in the Seven Mountains Mandate, which is a weaponized belief system and a coordinated campaign of narrative control. And all of this is executed through movements like QAnon, Turning Point USA Faith, and ReAwaken America.
I wanted to talk about fairies.
Right.
But then the world turned on its head and everything went crazy, not the least of which is the latest batch of Epstein emails.
Yeah.
And on the upshot, as more information about that comes out and we see some accountability happen, our cousins across the pond are showing us what you can do when the people push on power. Because my understanding is the Royals did that because they didn't want the MP and the PM and the people getting involved in who would be determining succession among royals.
Ah, right. You're talking about Prince Andrew, right?
It's correct,
Yeah.
And I think it would be good to start with the win. And I wanted to focus a little bit more on Andrew Longbottom, or whatever the hell his title is now, which is nothing, actually.
Right.
I think it's degenerate.
The black sheep.
And you can see the people in power start to feel the tick-tock, tick-tock. And we can see the guilty starting to run. And as the ship sinks, the rats all come out of the corners, don't they?
Right.
So in that process, we've seen people become exposed. And in the midst of all of that, there are a lot of questions about the Charlie Kirk assassination. And they're good questions. They're in advance of the trial, so we don't have all of the information. And I should mention that it's not uncommon for a prosecution to withhold information before a trial because they want to use it during the trial to convict the suspect.
Right.
But that said, it wouldn't explain the lies and inconsistencies that people are pointing out. So even if it ends up being a one-man job, the power struggle and the money and the struggle for influence that surrounded Charlie Kirk is coming into light.
Right.
And the influence that surrounded Charlie Kirk is leading people to make a lot of assumptions about potential connections to his death. And this stuff happens in a vacuum. If there's no information, people start to find the information and make connections on their own. You can call that a conspiracy theory if you want, but that's just how people are.
Right.
But some of those investigations into the people around him exposed a network that I think would make a good epilogue to our trilogy on power and control. Because we can demonstrate in the real world how one of those nodes, which is a theologically driven node, has gotten into power using money, manipulation, and influence. And so before we begin, I think it is important for me to point out we're going to be talking about Christianity again. And I think one fair criticism of our work is that we're too Western focused, but 62% of the United States identifies as Christian, and a big chunk of them are evangelicals. So as we talk about this, I want to make clear that I'm not talking about all of Christianity, and I'm not talking about all of evangelicals. The subject of Pentecostal history may come up today, and history is history, and Pentecostal churches vary widely. We're going to use words like charismatic churches, and that is also a wide spectrum. So if your church isn't being led by a charlatan that is inverting the Bible or calling themselves God, or insisting that if you give them money, you will somehow become rich, I'm probably not talking about your church.
Right.
And as you mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about the Seven Mountains Mandate. So that's actually a pretty good place to start.
Okay.
And not every church who believes in the Seven Mountains Mandate is involved in the type of power games that I'm going to be talking about. The specific node of money and faith manipulation we're going to be talking about involves all of those things. So the origin of the Seven Mountains Mandate is allegedly two pastors had a dream that God told them that they were to take over each of the 7 mountains or spheres of influence in society.
Okay.
And this can also be referred to as kingdom theology or dominionist theology. In their view, God told them to take dominion over the 7 spheres of influence in society. So that's government, education, media, business, religion, family, and the arts or entertainment.
Okay.
So the dominionist theology is theological. It's not cultural. It demands the occupation and reformation of secular structures by those it sees as anointed by God. Right? Anointed means chosen specifically and told directly by God. And that becomes very important in this movement.
Okay.
Out of this movement comes the main group we're going to be talking about, which is the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR or NAR, as it's referred to.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll stick with NAR because I have a problem with apostolic, which it's just for those listening, it's just a version of apostle, which I guess they see themselves as being the apostles.
Yes, and they believe that these are the new apostles. The Bible had its old apostles, and the people in the NAR are the new apostles that are being spoken to directly by God and can speak for God. So, sounds a lot like a cult already, right?
Right. The problem is, when I think of Pentecostal, I think of just, a small group of snake handlers in Appalachia, but we're talking about very powerful people.
So you couldn't be more wrong on that. Like, there are very normal Pentecostal churches.
Right.
And I'm glad you're saying that, because that's why I said that at the beginning. And I think people who are not as involved in Christianity, or especially people who aren't familiar with evangelicalism, will see all of this as being monolithic, and it's not. And so it also depends, like, how your pastor goes about teaching this theology and telling you to take it forward. So a lot of things can be good, a lot of things can be bad, but this particular movement sets people up for manipulation. And some people saw that, and they got involved, and they mixed up church and state, and they saw a means to power, and they've been using it. And that type of power invites corruption.
Right.
And this conversation is not happening in non-religious circles. Like, you don't even know about it. You're assuming all Pentecostals are snake handlers.
Right.
Like, to the religiously unaffiliated, like, this conversation isn't even happening,
Right.
So it's not from them that I'm taking this information. It's from Christians. This is a big topic in Christianity. This is a big topic in the church who's trying to figure this all out. And we set some of this up in our Schofield Bible episode when we talked about dispensationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And dispensationalism is one big part of Christian Zionism. But this other part is here, this kingdom and dominionist theory. And it also has a very anti-Semitic thread that runs right through the middle of it, due to its history. And its history could be traced all the way back to, some people would trace it all the way back to the 1400s, when the Pope said it's okay for you to go out and enslave and kill pagans and Saracens, meaning Muslims. And that's all on the table now.
Right.
Other people would trace its origin back to Scotland and Robert the Bruce in 1600, when Robert the Bruce frees Scotland from English and Irish control. He's given all these gifts, and one of them is a piece of artwork that has this story about how the Scots are actually the lost tribe of Israel, and they're the chosen people.
Really?
So this idea grows, and it gets all over the British Isles, and it becomes known as British Israelism. And it contains this idea of superiority, like racial superiority, and a negative view of Jewish Jews.
Okay.
And it contains these ideas of dominionism And it also has a very authoritarian structure because you're dealing with people who claim to be apostles. You're dealing with people who claim divine revelation. They cannot be questioned.
Oh, of course.
There's a lot of talk in these sermons about dissent and dissenters.
Right.
And questioners. Don't be a questioner.
Okay.
Just listen to what I got to say. I mean, literally, I've sat through a few of these and they're rough.
So just be quiet and obedient.
And give me money.
Of course, yeah.
And that's a big part of this too. We're bouncing around a little bit, but there's the prosperity gospel within this. So the prosperity gospel are best exemplified by televangelists. Like Kenneth Copeland is the biggest one, and he's worth $750 million. He's got his own airfield. And he goes on TV and he talks all about how God loves him so much that he keeps giving him money. And that if you give him money, you could be like him. So there's this exchange of prosperity, right? That like, obviously God loves me. That's why I have all the money.
Right.
You give me, it's a crazy sort of logic, but this is what they pitch. And then they claim divine revelation and they claim direct connection with God. And Kenneth Copeland has gone so far to basically say he's God or God-like, and you can be too if you just give him money. $1,000 will let him know you're really serious, and then everything you want will go good in your life. There's been a lot of exposés on the prosperity gospel. John Oliver, the comedian, did some really good ones.
It's interesting that that has roots in Scotland when you consider, Adam Smith. Wasn't he Scottish? The father of our modern capitalism. He wrote about the invisible hand of the economy.
That's an interesting connection for some later digging.
Yeah.
I wouldn't throw it out of hand, that's for sure. So this British Israelism works its way into the U.S., and it works its way in through the charismatic movement and Pentecostalism, which is really getting going around 1900, late 1800s. And this ties right into the time that Scofield is writing his Bible. So it's a mix. It becomes blended, right? You have this dispensationalist, revivalist ideas, and then you have these kingdom dominionist ideas, and they're overlapping, and things get a little mixed up. But they both have some sense of Christian Zionism in them. They both have some idea that Israel is very important to God's kingdom, and they also have this idea that they need to bring about God's kingdom. In dominionist theory, if they control the 7 spheres of influence, then they will be able to bring about the return of Christ.
Right.
And in dispensationalist ideas, they have to bring about the ascendancy of Israel in order to bring about the return of Christ. So these two groups can find common ground.
Right.
And this should add a dimension to what you're seeing in the news and how that works out politically. That's a big reason we're talking about this, because it's super relevant to what's happening today.
Mm-hmm.
And we just mentioned the prosperity gospel. Paula White Cain, who is Trump's spiritual advisor, is a part of this NAR, New Apostolic Reformation movement, and she's into the prosperity gospel. So she's directly connected to these groups. Trump is surrounded by these people. Russ Vaught, the Project 2025 stuff, it's all being informed by this 7 mountains mandate and this dominionist theology.
Right.
And the reason it gets so confusing between dominionist and dispensationalist is because they're overlapping. So it is confusing. It is a little messy there. But these are 2 threads of theology that are making up this Christian Zionist movement, which is at the forefront of what's becoming, let's be honest, it's a MAGA civil war.
Right.
And MAGA is a movement. So it's made up of various movements. And within that, you have this movement, which has a deep thread of anti-Semitism in it. So kingdom and dominionist theology were popular with the Klan.
Oh, okay.
The
Makes
Ku
sense.
Klux Klan.
Yeah. Oh, them.
I didn't mean the Wu-Tang Clan.
Right.
That puts them into racialist ideas in the mid-20th century. So that goes all the way into today. Those groups have lineage. They have direct line. They have a succession that they can point to and that they're proud of that goes all the way back there. So that's a part of this movement. And it's kind of incompatible on one level with the dispensationalist idea that tends to put Israel first. So I would consider it a massive miscalculation on the part of the Netanyahu regime to cozy up to this group and attempt to manipulate this group into supporting his wars, because at some point they were always going to wake up and realize that this was not in their interests and that it was in the interests of a group that they hated.
Right.
And so this massive wave of anti-Semitism was an unfortunately predictable betrayal. And I hope that makes it clear as we talk about Israel that when we take issue, we're taking issue with the Netanyahu regime and their choices.
Right.
It's not even all Israelis, certainly not all Jews.
Of course not,
and I can separate those three things because I can drive a friggin' car.
Right.
But if we're going to unpack it, we have to be able to call a spade a spade. And Netanyahu knew that this movement contained anti-Semitism. It's certainly not all of MAGA, but there's a thread here that runs right through theology and into politics, and people who blend theology and politics. And I cannot believe that Netanyahu didn't know that. And yet he did this anyway to pursue his own agenda. And he did not think of what that was going to do to the Jewish people of America when this backlash happened. And it was very predictable.
Right.
He's like an extremist. You know, this is the way Hamas thinks. They think, oh, well, the backlash will drive them closer to me.
Right.
And I think it's just responsible for us to point all that out with things being said online that could be perceived as anti-Semitic.
Yeah. My first exposure to this, the Nar organization, was back when the news hit that there was not a chief justice, but a member of the Supreme Court had their flag flying at their home, right? And that was an appeal to heaven flag, and it had the little tree. It's just, that's the first time I've heard of that organization.
Yeah, and they deliberately sometimes stay in the shadows. You can watch a video of one of the so-called apostles giving a presentation on how all of this works. And at the end, he says, you can either do this overt or covert.
Okay.
And that's going to get us into the juiciest bits that we're going to talk about today, the covert part. But first, let's get a little bit more context so we know what we're talking about. So by the 2000s, there was a guy named C. Peter Wagner, and he was really the founder of NAR. And Dutch Sheets, Cindy Jacobs, and Lance Wallnau, who I just mentioned, were pushing the Seven Mountain strategy explicitly into the realm of politics. So this is when their churches started mixing church and state. Not all of Christianity did this, and it's a small segment. You and I did some analysis about 2 weeks ago, and I think we put this at 13%.
Right.
But they taught that believers must take political power back from ungodly elites. So they were talking about the elites too. What does that remind you of?
Right away, it reminds me of QAnon.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. They also wanted you to believe that these apostles and prophets are the modern equivalent of biblical kings or judges. They specifically want you to see them as Elijah, that they are telling you biblical prophecy. And then the third part of this is that political adversaries are not your opponents. They're not your neighbors. They are demonic agents.
Of course.
That's the third part of this. And their demonology gets really extensive and pretty silly. They start talking about territorial demons, and the Queen of Heaven comes up a lot. They're like, we sent these 27 missionaries up a mountain to battle the Queen of Heaven, and they made all these videos about it, right? The Queen of Heaven is also a phrase that has been used in Catholic history to refer to the Virgin Mary.
Sure, yeah.
This NAR movement has a big problem with Catholicism.
Okay.
So it's not even a sideways way to say we're fighting Catholicism, which we think is demonic, because some of them have even said that the Catholics have elevated Mary to the point of idolatry making her some form of territorial demon.
Okay. Well, I mean, that would make sense when you look at our government. I mean, we are pretty much a patriarchy still, and it's being reinforced by religious movements.
Yes, this movement is very patriarchal and authoritative, totalitarian. It's written in. Even the money is written in. It's like in most churches, you have a board, you have a process for the finances. In these churches, it's written into the rules that the money goes straight to the preacher.
Jeez. Right.
And none of these are taxable. So people like Kenneth Copeland says, send me $1,000, and he never has to pay taxes on it.
Yeah.
So that gives them skin in the game. That makes them a power node. Now they're a power player with money. And it's not just them, the ones that are visible on TV. It's people like Robert Mercer, who was very involved early on. He had a whole conservative takeover plan. Everything I just mentioned about ungodly elites, apostles and prophets being now, and political adversaries being demonic agents, all of these things were a part of the QAnon movement.
Right.
And guess who's all over this NAR network?
Well, you must be talking about Michael Flynn, because I know he's been traveling around the country for years now in this kind of big tent Christian revivalist movement where he's obviously taking advantage of old folks.
Yeah, the ReAwaken tour. That came up in our research here.
Right.
That was one of the big connections. That ReAwaken tour has all sorts of connections to this NAR movement. And then, the January 6th event, there were a number of people involved in that were also involved in QAnon. And 4 out of the 6 permits that were issued for that event were NAR-affiliated churches.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So they were driving that too. And did they really care if people got busted, thrown in jail for a little while, and had to wait for a pardon? I don't think they did.
No. Yeah, that's the big picture of it all. It almost sounds like a cultural revolution, and like what we saw in China in the '60s. But this is deeply religious, but still, you could see the danger in it. The power, there's too much power and abuse of power. How many people died in the Cultural Revolution?
That's what happens when you mix church and state. And I think that's part of the genius of the American system, is keep it separate.
Right.
Because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that came up a lot in the research in some of these groups. The ones that are authoritarian. And I would caution Christians to use your discernment and decide whether your church is authoritarian and whether you can really trust whoever it is you're placing all of your faith in. Most churches are not. I'm not talking about most of Christianity. It's just that con men have known since the beginning, even in the early biblical stories, there's all these warnings about con men coming in and saying, I speak for Jesus. This has been happening since the beginning, and you got to take it head on. And these conversations are happening in the Christian community. So if you're a Christian and you're not aware of it, I would really encourage you to just do some searching on YouTube for Christian channels that are talking about what we're talking about. I don't think what we're saying is going to sound much different.
It just gets, it's creeping me out, because if they're calling themselves apostles and they're trying to gain control of basically every facet of American culture, what's the real plan? The plan is nothing but power.
And it starts to sound like any other radical ideology, like you would find in Al-Qaeda or anything like that, where it's like, I am the absolute divine truth. Your mission is to take over the world for me.
Right.
And it is okay if you die in the process.
Right.
Because your reward is coming later. Same sort of idea. And then what we find with this kingdom and dominionist groups is that some of them took power in the same way as any decentralized, I'm sorry, but terror group would do.
Right.
And it was decentralized even at the denominational level. This part I found really fascinating, was that in the early days, it was like they knew what they were saying was so wrong and so corrupt, and that they were going to get found out so quickly, they didn't want to create a denomination. So what they did was they created individual churches and then networked. So I'm a new apostle, you're a new apostle. And then they would even manufacture division. So they would have somebody split off and say, no, God told me this. And the other guy would say, no, God told me this. And then they would split up, and both churches would then refill the pews with a whole new set of people, and they were all in the same network.
Huh. Interesting.
So it was sneaky and manipulative from the beginning. And if it's not your church, it's not your church.
Right.
But this is a thread that's existed in Christianity all the way until now, and it's worked its way into power. And QAnon became the perfect info weapon to do that. And QAnon is a really good way for us to exemplify this, because it just became an opportunity. It became an opportunity that they capitalized on and turned into a movement that would support their agenda.
And of course, Michael Flynn, he was also famous for making, public pledges to QAnon, right? Didn't they have some kind of verbal pledge?
Oh, he was beyond pledging. He was involved in the online engagement. He was involved in recruiting. And I think he was involved in steering it.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about where Q came from, because people have done a lot of research. There's some great research out there that pulls in the metadata. Bellingcat, if you've heard of them, they're a public intelligence agency, and they did a bunch of work on QAnon, and it was corroborated by other independent researchers as well. And the funny part about all that is that it started as a shit post. That is the name of it on message boards. It's a shit post. It's just somebody saying stuff randomly, right?
Right.
Trolling.
But it started in 4chan, though, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, it started as a shit post in 4chan, and then it started taking off, and the original shit poster seemed to have gotten off of it, but then some grifters come in, and they start controlling it, and then it moves over to 8chan, where the grifter owners appear to have steered it for a while, but they were steering it, right? They were doing so at somebody's behest, and they were doing so with an agenda that they were sharing with other people, and they weren't telling people. And then there was the characters that got involved to become the mouthpieces of QAnon, and they called themselves prophets.
Right.
And we saw a lot of mixing of the occult and prophecy, which shows up a lot in the history of Pentecostalism. So, like, for example, California has a deep history with Pentecostalism.
Really?
Yeah, and this is really where the occult overlaps start to get big. Because in 1906, there's a big fire and an earthquake in San Francisco. It destroys 500 blocks of the city, and it kills more than 3,000 people. It produced some mass migration, and it was apocalyptic. It was an explosion. Things were on fire. It looked like the end of the world. And so then there became a surge of spiritualist and mediumistic and occult activity around that. And because that was really big at the time. And so was Schofield, and so was Crowley. I mean, all of these ideas converge around this time. And so there was a massive network of refugees that passed through Los Angeles, where this movement, this Azusa revival, was gaining steam. And so they brought into the pews things like Christian seances, Christian mediums, Christian psychic healers, Christian fortune tellers. And it was a bunch of theosophists as well from Blavatsky's crowd. So it gets all mixed up into Pentecostalism even back then. And those traditions are more friendly to the occult. And as you can imagine, that does not go over big with mainline Protestants or Catholics.
Right.
So that's just one example of occultism and Christianity getting all mixed up. But then it does heavily in this QAnon world. And it gets involved with conspiracy theories, and it becomes a choose your own adventure. And in some charismatic movements like the NAR, they don't really seem to care too much what the individual thinks. As long as they're following the main leader and doing what they're supposed to be doing, you can have aberrant beliefs if you want.
Right.
But the central tenets of that QAnon conspiracy were very similar to what these kingdom dominionist movements would espouse for theology, like a satanic cabal controls the world. Trump is God's chosen warrior. Mass arrests will cleanse the land, and the faithful must trust the plan. Like these are all parts of that charismatic thread that we just talked about.
Right.
And you have all kinds of different people with different ideas in there. It wasn't all right when COVID was going on, and a lot of people went, what the hell is this? I mean, I've never been in a lockdown. Everything looks crazy. So it drew in a lot of people.
Yeah.
And these NAR leaders saw that, and they capitalized on it. So how deliberate was it? How much did they get involved in the actual production of QAnon messages? I would say if they did, they got involved at more of the directional level, probably not on the executional level, because we know who that was.
Right.
But key NAR leaders like Michael Flynn, Dutch Sheets, Lance Wallnau, Charlie Shamp, they amplified that QAnon message about spiritual war, hidden evil, Trump, divine justice, the end of days. I mean, it was this whole narrative that they were pushing. And it's a fair question to ask, how coordinated was that? Where was the coordination happening? On what level? What connected these people? And it's the NAR. And the NAR is all kind of mixed up in Turning Point USA.
Okay.
And I don't know if that adds anything to the investigation about the assassination, but it is important knowledge for anyone who is interested in those organizations. And you had Michael Flynn out there. He was openly referencing Seven Mountains language and echoing Q slogans in the same breath, calling for spiritual revolution. And he was invoking divine assignments. He was saying, this is your mandate. This is what God wants you to do. I mean, and this is blasphemy. You don't speak for God.
Right.
It's beyond heretical. All of this, it's like heretical is just too kind a term.
Yeah. I mean,
perversion, inversion.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder how many of them, the leaders of this movement, how many of them actually believe what they're saying, or it's just become a power game.
And that's how they used it. They used that Q-infused energy. They mobilized the base, and the NAR aligned Christian nationalists to start seeking footholds in governance. Yeah. Flynn was literally on all of these things telling people to run for their local office, run for school board. Let's start taking over at this level. Then we'll take over at this level. And even if you believe in a desecularized society, you have to question who's at the top. What do they believe? Is it your beliefs? Is it Christian? Is it Christ-like? But we have people like Paula White-Cain who believe in the prosperity gospel, which I already said is beyond heretical. It's blasphemous. And this is Trump's spiritual advisor. So I would not want to live in a Christian society under her. That came out of her fantasies, that's for sure.
Right.
But it also involved youth mobilization, and that's where they went after Turning Point USA. And they got all kinds of involved in that. They were recruiting people under the guise of patriotism or faith or being anti-woke. They were using populist ideas like, hey, we know it's tough out there. Come with us. We've got you covered.
Yeah, of course.
And that's good. Like, I mean, we have populist ideas too, but they don't require your beliefs. And all of this rhetoric was used, the spiritual rhetoric was used for political means. And one thing that is waking people up to this and causing more and more people to look into this is our current state. I mean, we're talking about this because it's our current state. Our current state involves people in power with an agenda that none of us seem to understand, that is not working for the American people. And both the right and the left are waking up to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, and you have to remember that this is a small fringe group.
Yes. And who's driving them? I don't know that we have a single answer to that question. What we have is a network, like we found in our trilogy on Who Runs the World. And this is a great example of that. I think this is a good epilogue to it. And as you can see, it just can help you perhaps decode some of the news. If you have context, if you have historical context, if you understand some of the agendas that may be at play. We're not making any allegations about backroom cabals here. We're saying there are people who got into power with an agenda, and they're not being completely transparent about what that agenda is with people.
Right.
Because by 2024 and 2025, this has evolved into narrative warfare, alternative media echo chambers that are just keep repeating the same trust the plan nonsense, and they keep building on the same narrative. And then there's these mobilization arms. There's TPUSA Faith, there's ReAwaken America, there's Flashpoint Live, and these are efforts to mobilize people. That's fine. If that's what you believe in, if they have good works, that's good. But figure out who's at the top. Know where the money comes from. That's discernment. And then we have to look at who the players are at the political and legal levels and what they're doing. So when you know that Pete Hegseth walked into the Pentagon and did all those weird speeches about push-ups in front of all those generals.
No beardos.
Doesn't it take on a different context when you understand that Pete Hegseth is one of these kingdom dominionist types that thinks that he's taking over the world?
Right.
And by the way, at the end of all of this, these NAR apostles have said that they would be this little board of advisors to all of the leaders in the world, not just America. America is just the first step. You control the military, and then you control the world, and then they all answer to us.
Right.
The televangelists.
Yeah, great plan.
Not a world I'm looking for. But yet they've gotten entrenched in power. I think what's fascinating here is that it worked. And let me tell you something about Flynn. I heard of Flynn while I was in. He had a reputation, and his reputation had two parts. It was, that guy's really good at finding terrorists. He's really good at hunting down cells. Number two was that he was crazy and paranoid.
Ah, yeah.
And everyone thought that those two things were inseparable. They were necessary to be as good as he was at what he did. And what he did was counterinsurgency for cell networks. So if someone understands cell networks well, it's Michael Flynn out there.
Yeah, interesting.
I can't imagine he just put all of that information away when he went about doing this.
When he found the Lord. Yeah.
Oh, he found the Lord back then too. I don't question his beliefs. I question what he's up to and what he's telling people and how he's using people. And if you're going to tell people to follow your movement and what you want them to do, then you should be telling them why and who's involved and what your agenda is. That's my issue. If they're going to follow you, that's fine. That's their business.
Right.
It's this covert part of it that Wallnow talked about, that Flynn gets involved, that looks painfully deliberate.
Right. So, this is all very, very American. I mean, we're always confronted by religious figures, like televangelists have been around forever. And we're okay with them being religious, but then we think, but why do they need all this money? And why are they asking me for money on TV? So, we have to, it's not just TV anymore, obviously. It's, we have to look into the playbook and how they manipulate the public. And obviously, number one is fear. You have to use fear. That's the easiest way that's been used since the beginning of time. So you have demonized elites. They talk about like you said before, the satanic cabal, which in their eyes is everything part of the Democratic Party. You have faith hooks, which is basically saying, this is part of God's plan. And you have to be, if you're a real Christian, you have to follow God's plan. Community, obviously, church rallies, you have prayer networks, you have people online that are having online prayers. You have Michael Flynn, traveling the country too, and just taking it on the road. And of course, identity politics.
Yeah, specifically targeting people who are lonely.
Right.
I feel like that's a good point. Like they targeted people who were lonely and
Definitely.
gave them community. And then the worst manipulation that happened there is the online part, because they tricked these people into believing that they were part of an online community that couldn't give a crap about them.
Yeah. It's true. And then,
That's
when you throw in
cry from a
4chan
church.
and 8chan, there's that aspect of people putting way too much meaning into it because they think it's kind of this underground information source where they can get meaningful information that's beyond the fray, but it's BS.
Yeah, it gave people a feeling of being special. It gave them a feeling of exclusivity, which gave them a feeling of superiority, which led to, of course, identity politics, which I think is next on your list.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's the biggest one when it comes to identity politics is the victimhood, right? The Christian, we talked about this in previous episodes where they're basically simultaneously in power and also the victims of power.
You're right. It has been used as a tool of manipulation. Like, are Christians persecuted? Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair to say on campuses that sometimes their voice saying, look, I don't believe that. And then they get shouted down.
Right.
And try not shouting them down, and maybe some of this dissonance will go away.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I went to college in the Bible Belt. I was confronted by preachers all the time, door to door or on campus. And the best way to confront it is just don't give them a devil to attach to. Don't give them the face of the devil. Talk to them and be reasonable. It always kind of twists. It throws them for a loop sometimes because they have this preconceived idea that anyone who's not Christian is part of the evil cabal.
I heard an evangelical pastor say that some Jehovah's Witnesses came to his door and said, "Hey, we want to talk to you about Jesus." And he said, "Come on in."
Right. And they're probably like, "Uh-oh."
But these QAnon narratives provided some sort of conspiracy glue, right? That there was the vaccine fear, there was the Great Reset idea that people who were already in America were being replaced by immigrants. There was UAPs. I mean, people used our stuff, right, to get into this. And I think that gets us into it because we have to clarify some of this and go, how is this all related? And how it's related to UAPs, actually, I'll just touch on real quick, is we've talked about the Collins Elite. And the Collins Elite is an informal group of congressmen that are rumored to both exist and be very much against UAP disclosure because they think it's all demonic.
Right.
And so some members of those Collins Elite groups are very much some of these people. So there is overlap there. For sure.
Right. So they're working behind the scenes to basically slow down any disclosure.
Yes, this is one more group that is against UAP disclosure. Right. It's much easier to come up with a list of people who are on the side of UAP disclosure than it is to list all of the people that are against it. Yeah.
Right.
But these things took over certain digital channels. They took over YouTube. They took over TikTok for a little while. They took over Telegram. And it provided a huge online reach for whomever wanted to use it. And for a while, there was QAnon was providing just basic influencer type cover for the news. And so that was being used for a little while as just a political mouthpiece. And the result was tens of millions of people believing that they're in a cosmic battle.
Yeah. And we got to look into motives. It's obviously it's not just a group of very religious people looking to get into heaven. They have an agenda on this mortal coil. They have a lot of influence and power. And I think this is kind of a blend of you got American-style Christianity, which is innately about capitalism, right? You talk about the prosperity gospel, and then but you also have have this American Christianity, but you also have this kind of global view with Israel and all that, and a political view And I think the last part has to do with kind of our modern times, right? Because again, you have religious figures and political figures that don't like how the country's moving culturally. And you mix that with also the internet, where we just had the past 15 years, everyone's crazy uncle and grandfather got an online account, and things started to change really quickly. And so we got this specific group now. It's very infiltrated. It has infiltrated our government. What is their exact motive?
What is their motive, and why are we talking about it now? I think is also a question. Right?
Yeah.
So their motives are power-based. It's a theology of dominion. You can agree with that or not, but that is their belief. They believe that God commanded them to take over all of the earthly systems in order for Christ to return. And already that should give you more information about some of the things you see in the news. They have an apocalyptic urgency, and they believe that America is facing some form of divine judgment. It sure feels like that. Can't really blame them, right? And they see a power vacuum, and they exploited it.
Yeah.
So the old GOP is falling off. That old coalition is falling off. MAGA is a whole new coalition. Mm-hmm. Whole new coalition. And they saw a power vacuum there that they wanted to fill with their own agenda and make them at the top.
Yeah.
And this is also revenge on secular modernity. They reject pluralism, feminism,
right.
multiculturalism, globalism, global warming. And there's all of these new things, AI, everything that's new gets a label of demonic attached to it.
Right.
And that's easy to sell because people prefer the old way. They're like, I don't want the new iPhone. I want the old one. And that one's demonic.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, it's easy to manipulate on topics that people don't understand.
But ultimately, the motives here come down to what they do so often, which is money and control. Once they're embedded in government, this network can redirect policies, which they have. They can redirect contracts, which they have.
Yeah.
And they can redirect media access into its own infrastructure, which they are trying to do, which makes this relevant, it makes it the perfect example and one that we can affect from all of our research lately on who controls what in the world. Because QAnon may have faded, but the core dynamics of that movement still live on. There's still this idea of spiritual authoritarianism, which I don't think is well supported by the Bible. Maybe the Old Testament. But it sees the culture war as a holy war, and it only sees one side of it. And this is not objective. I don't think it's terribly Christian, right?
Yeah, and it's definitely a culture war. That's the part that kind of scares me a little. When you have a group of powerful people calling themselves apostles, what are they going to be writing the new books of this new form of Christianity that that blends American political power with money?
And that's their hope, is that they can mobilize a base for apocalyptic action, which will give them a form of elite control via a theocracy.
Yeah.
You replace the old elites with the new. And there's a few people running around trying to do this, right? Like Teal. And this should make some of what he's doing make sense. He saw these people doing this and he said, hey, this is where the power is going. This is where the structure is going. This is where the contracts are going. I need to get on board with them. I'm going to come up with my kooky Antichrist ideas. Yeah. So this should make that make sense a little bit more too. When you look at the history here, the past is present.
Yep. So yeah, it sounds like that seven mountains aren't coming; they're here, and I hope this kind of made sense to our listeners because we just it's a huge topic. It could be a 7-episode series really if we want to cover this topic, but sum it up a little because it's a big topic, and we wanted to talk about fairies. We're gonna
that
get
was
to
my
that.
plan, and I'm so excited to talk to you guys about fairies because I just reread Robert Kirk's book, and there's so much in there from like 1691 that is so similar to what we were saying in our episodes that I think it's really striking. But then in the midst of all of that, I started to learn about the NAR, and that sent me down this very deep rabbit hole. And this is just scratching the surface. I will add some good links for good research on this subject, but I would really recommend people look at the history here. Look at the history of the NAR, look at the history of charismatic movements, look at the history of Pentecostalism in America, and just read the history. And then practice your discernment. There is nothing wrong with that sort of knowledge. So I'll put some of those links below. But I feel like trying to do this in one episode is insane with the amount of topics that we just touched on. What we were hoping to do here is give you a cohesive narrative to show you why they're all relevant to today, why it's something that you could pay attention to, why it's something that would add insight to all of these things that are going on. And I think it's also good food for you investigators and researchers out there. I know that there are people who have podcasts and blogs that listen to this show, and I know that some of you listen to the shows and then contribute to those different podcasts and shows through email, and that's all great. We love it when people do that with us as well. So I'm hoping that those of you with the investigative bug could take this even a little further and maybe even strengthen some of those connections between some of these networks and real events, and maybe try to put them into a map and a timeline so that we can understand how deliberate all of this is. I mean, is it really just opportunity exposing itself and then people who take advantage of opportunity jumping on board? Or are we looking at a plan?
Right.
It usually ends up being a mix of both, right?
Right. Well, that wraps up this episode. It's always good talking to you, Ram. Fairies and UFOs, we're going to get back to it. I really wanted to talk about that, but, reality hits, and sometimes the topics just come to us, and we have to cover them.
And it gave me an extra week to look into fairies that much more, because that's a huge subject too.
Yeah.
I feel like we're going to be just barely scratching the surface, but I'm going to try to stick to the stuff that, since our audience has some context there, I'm going to try to stick to the stuff that we already know about UAPs and that Kirk is saying back in 1691. It's nuts.
Right. All right, well, thanks again, everyone, for listening. Please visit our website at forteanwinds.com.
Thanks, y'all. Take care out there.